Hello everyone, a question and answer video today regarding the role of grace in the pagan transfiguration, and we'll see better now what the deal is, because it's not an easy question at all, and I want to thank in this sense the author in the comments for it. This was a question posed under the recent video I made about Ambrose of Milan, Symmachus, and the altar of victory. And let's simply read it. So, how universal was the belief of a possible transfiguration through one's work alone? Many of the heroes that become gods or stars were already of divine birth or through divine intervention. For example, think of Romulus, Diomedes, the Dioscuri. They were all divine blood and benefited from the aid by one or more gods. Couldn't that also be broadly considered a form of grace? Also, in the Vedic tradition, Arjuna needed the intervention of Krishna to be able to fully fulfill his duty. To further clarify, I do not intend the whole Christian meaning of grace, but only it as the necessary medium for transfiguration. So again, this is a powerful question, and I will answer it, let's say, maybe not the best I can, because still we have actually to make videos that is scheduled actually about the same Vedic religion, part as an introduction, and also other mythology involving the aforementioned heroes. So we will hopefully cover this. I scheduled it actually for this autumn, winter, so I hope to start with it pretty soon. As a premise, this is a much more difficult question to answer than it seems, for the simple reason that in many ways we don't know all the explicitation of the doctrine, right? So we have to essentially, of course, research and deduce this from the material available that is also very historically determined and heterogeneous, right? The same example of Krishna and Arjuna, we're talking about texts such as the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Gita that are, from the end of the first millennium BC at the beginning of the first AD, right? So a very late time compared to the Veda that, as you know, existed millennia before Christ, and that left an incredibly few material or tangible trace, except for this extremely powerful, in fact, moral legacy that survived in Hinduism, that, however, had thoroughly transformed in something else. The same can be said about Roman history, that doesn't have quite, say, a sacred text per se, right, overall, but the Roman sagas naturally tell the story of, in fact, those time of heroes, right, so between myth and history. And also, there we proceed by analogy, and we can also diachronically perceive the gradual kind of decay that all these religions were perfectly aware to be happening as specific eras of humanity, and that for the ultimate and the final battle and ultimate struggle, that in this regard, as you know, from the Christian, from a Christian perspective, is much more kind of optimistically looked at, even though it shouldn't. And this will be perhaps the point of this video. Maybe we are misinterpreting Christianity exactly as a consequence of the decayed historical times, right? And the same concept of faith and grace and transfiguration have a broader universal meaning in the history of religion that cannot simply be reduced to a few. Like when you ask even anyone, right, about these topics, assuming that they know what they are, but let's say even in a more, let's say, Indo-European religions and other traditional religions are a bit off the horizons. But even Christianity, that is prominently still known, and don't think that we will forget it in a long time. Probably people in a couple of generations will not even have the faintest idea what the hell Christianity was. But this is as sad as it sounds, because it will have probably reached the end of all forms of sacredness and of spirituality and awareness regarding these things. So there are many different views about the same Christian grace, and so this is why, for example, this question is so provoking. And fortunately enough, at the end he says, to further clarify, I don't not intend the whole Christian meaning of grace, but only it as the necessary medium for transfiguration. Well, thanks, as this will prevent us from digressing endlessly on the enormous issues that there are in the various interpretations of Christianity, also confessionally and more. But it's not that simple either, right? So I will try to make it simple, as generally speaking question and answer videos are, but we will have to go very much in detail with it too. Now, first of all, how universal was the belief of a possible transfiguration through one's work alone? So the whole question, not just a single one, but this one is crucial to be answered. And I know it because I remember the video at some point refers to the fact that I spoke of work alone without addressing faith, right? But the author's question here doesn't address faith either, right? And I intend the question, in fact, to be correctly understanding what it was talking about in that video, right? So obviously, wherever we talk about work, we're talking about faith as well, right? Because there is an intention, there is, in fact, that kind of consciousness and proper determination that the faith, the fides, entails. So to answer the specific question, well, this was pretty much universal. Yes, right. So the examples also that you make later are meaningful, because it is true that in those traditions, for how they arrived to us, are relatively late, actually very late, but still, it's a big deal for us to have it in the first place. And the Vedic one, as you know, is the cornerstone for the entire Indo-European understanding, right? Without that, we would have a much poorer understanding of Roman religion, of Germanic religion, or anything. The question is, to me, like, it was really universal, right? There is a debate about this. Not everybody agrees, right? But the problem also with grace that we will see now, that we often conceive grace, grazia, in what eventually Christianity made of it, at least in its function. And you know that Christianity uses a vocabulary that is the one essentially either, it was written in many languages, but principally from our, eventually in the West, was digested in the areas that had remained somewhat closer, in fact, to the traditional spirituality. And so we have come to associate more easily, right, concepts like of glory, faith, etc. Grace didn't figure excessively, right? We'll talk about grace later, but it's important immediately to distinguish the graces, right, in the Hellenic, eventually Roman mythology, that are Pelasgian deities, right, from the gratia, or grazia, as it was eventually adopted by Christianity. And also the important differences that exist, as you know, in Western Christianity, Catholic or Protestant alike, as opposed to the Orthodox world, where grace is considered in a different fashion and not so easily and individually disposable of through, for example, through the sacraments, etc. In any case, this is not, again, let's not digress on the point. I truly think, yes, that transfiguration through one's work/fate alone, so the individual's one, and this is again what the question understands well, was truly universal. The idea of liberation through one's own power and not through, say, the deteriorator concept of grace that I guess most people buy, that is this kind of merely passive waiting for it, right? And so in order to attain it, I truly believe it was the case. As I was saying before, in order to answer the broader question, you have to make an effort in thinking of who was believing this, meaning which part of the people was believing it, right? Because if we are to look at the nobiliar dimension and those who really believed that there could be a superimposition between the sacred and the human in form of rulers, right? And this was the norm up to Christianity, that again was more ambiguous, and this is not that it ever abandoned it. This is the problem, right? That especially Catholicism still maintains dramatically some of the older traditional concepts that could not be denied, especially in a world that has its spread, like in the Roman one, where instead the imperial cult was so deeply rooted and was so self-evident for the same nature of the empire. You would have had like two different religions almost. Like the religion was all the same, right? And whatever we also use the terms, we can't make a lot of difference. But of course, the idea is that the senator would have liked to be burned. The plebeian would like to be buried, because they didn't think. They think there was a role, first of all, right? The old tradition literally stated, like in the cases also of the Veda, that you cannot quite, that there is not, that there is an order, right, through which the same divine manifests itself in nature, in this consonance with the Dharma, with the cosmic law, right? That not only degrades the individual who mixes with the lower ones, but also that alterates negatively the nature of the lower one as well, right? As gold and lead, I think this was the saying, are mixed. Like you don't have that their role, their nature is altered in any way. So, as we know in this world doctrine, the concept was that the same transfiguration could be achieved through the elevation of the lower part of ourself through the same use of the one. And so it's literal transfiguration eventually. I made a video which is the Indo-European doctrine of self-sacrifice that talks about it extensively and explains this the struggle within yourself at the end of the day. That is partly the same one that allowed the same Christianity to say that you can be justified by faith alone in the as an absolute extreme, whereas the same time the same New Testament does speak of the worthlessness of faith without work as well, but with a much greater importance of faith, right, given over the work per se. Answering this first chunk of the question means to realize that before the latter concept, there couldn't be any attainable merit without work in the first place, as much as this couldn't be done without faith, that essentially consists in the true belief, in the Stoic, let's say, apathetic confidence in one's own action, like the complete lack of fear, right, of what is for Arjuna the softness of the soul, for which Krishna intervenes by saying, look, making the famous speech presenting itself and explaining what it is. And in that sense, again, in the Mahabharata, actually pointing out that yes, Arjuna's enemies would have been crushed by Krishna, but in this sense, we shouldn't think that there also, for the concept of grace, that Krishna was kind of taking over Arjuna's work, right? He exhorts him, right? And he wins fairly against his opponents because he was capable of achieving that consonance with Krishna, right? That is the personal principle, the absolute one, whereas Arjuna is the individual one. He's a single hero that is not God but becomes one, as they basically, Arjuna fights on the chariot together with he fights alone, right? And that's a metaphor of our own internal struggle as individuals, but next to the cosmic power that, in this sense, offers this consonance, right? Can we interpret this as grace? We will see it now. The simple question is yes, but again, we have to determine better what grace is, right? So, yes, that was the point. Fate brings to works, right? And as I was just saying, it is true also in the pagan, let's call it erroneously so, but still, that what we call pagan tradition, even the actual outcome is relative, right? All the great heroes were aiming at becoming the absolute, right? Think about Mithras. That is an interesting example, as we'll see also, because he's actually born out of a stone, right? It's not actually a big deal. It's a titanic history rather than a divine Uranian one. But at the end of the day, he struggles with the sun, and he becomes as identified with it at the same time. And as you know, it becomes, in that sense, an Apollonian figure, and he has transfigured in this regard. But still, this is relative to what happens to that degree of our own individual limitation. That is to say, yes, we can transfigure, but how much, right? Because the hierarchy of the world and of heavens, especially in the pagan tradition, is not really distinguished from the earthly human reality. Like there is, of course, it's distinguished in concept, but there is no boundary between that, right? It's not truly as we have come to witness it in Christianity, that tended for reasons we'll explain now, but not quite admits it, say, to a hypostatically distance, to an incommensurable degree, heaven from earth, right? And so stressing also the value of the medium, but generally speaking, fishing more among those who thought that the heaven was impossible to attain individually, for which they needed Christ to get them rid of that what appeared kind of unsurpassable lowness that, however, still in the pagan world theoretically was thought could be surpassed, but just was evidenced by the status of the people to a certain degree, because nobody would have thought that a slave could actually become an emperor, for the same reason that as long as he was, that equated, given that fate and works went in parallel, to the fact that that guy had deserved that lower status. So yes, let's say how universal this belief was, that transfiguration could happen through one's work alone, was naturally differently understood by this different degree of the dimming of the awareness among different, say, peoples, and social status, just to make that example. The point of the question is that, yes, there was a divine intervention as well, that we can understand as grace. right? But the worthiness in that regard was of such grace was resting on the individual alone, right? Many people say, why did, for example, Krishna love Arjuna so much? And in the sacred texts, it seems as if, in fact, he makes an important set of work for him, right? Even think about, just not just about Krishna, but think about Shiva's weapons that Arjuna uses, all the skills that he earns, etc. But the point is that Arjuna was simply deserving that, right? Because he was able essentially to choose Krishna over, for example, his entire army. I mean, he's Arjuna's entire army. And thus realizing that the only mean to attain victory is to leave any other desire behind, any other concern, any other element, but the truth that, by the way, encompasses them all, and therefore that awareness makes Arjuna recognize Krishna as the sole truth, and so the intelligence of the intelligent, the beauty of the beautiful, etc. Consider that in all this we are thinking, we shouldn't be thinking, of course, that divinity exists in different varieties of divinity, right? Divinity exists as an absolute, right, that encompasses the world. Of course, in a cosmic struggle, that is also that is the focal point, let's say, of the entire point of redemption, and then because, as you know, within the same Christianity, there is a big deal. Think about St. John's Gospel, etc. Of the presence of this, especially Iranian kind of cosmic struggle, and that also gave birth to some dualistic heresies, because, let's say, of the risk of considering the struggle for the end of time, just like the storming of the Asgard and so on, as like okay, we have just the better God from our side, so we shouldn't care, right? The love for God and the absolute and the truth cannot but take in consideration that absolute struggle and doctrine of self-sacrifice to accomplish through one's own death in holy war, right? So Arjuna fully understands that, or at least this is the ambiguity. It's always a dual issue. Like this is not just true for Christianity. This is true for our human condition, for our limitation, right? Up to which point did Arjuna understand that? When he hesitates before battle, of course, that there you see there is, in fact, a didactic purpose of the sacred text that we understand as such, but just like the Bible, it's humanly made, right? So it does reflect the human deficiency, right, in these matters, and exemplifies how the problem can be surpassed. So in this regard, also the personification of the gods, right? These are advanced cultures we're talking about, so they personified gods and so on. The early legions of the Indo-Europeans and other people were still within the realm of broader, concepts, right? That mostly people were used to live by rather than kind of thinking about, because they were much more pressured by those needs of struggle and victory to immediately identify them without this kind of parabolic, again, didactic, edifying stories, right? Even though they surely existed already at that time, but were thought there to really represent it. Again, where is the moment that mankind was not fallen by a certain degree, right? We will see it now regarding the divine mix, because I don't know, I've never seen anyone transfiguring so far, and they may have thought the same in their own time for, a accepting that still there is a big doubt about what we all see, and that there shouldn't be, in virtue of this doctrine, that objectively does boost forward any kind of human further any kind of human character that we can think, with maximizing it and whatever. And this is the incredible point, scientifically and morally. It all works. Like, it's all true, right? Even if we can't grasp the truth as entirely as throughout our poor cognitive means, because otherwise we would literally transfigure, as we would immediately even just act as such, right? And so being there again, a direct correspondence between fate and work, it's always a liminal concept, right? Then eventually gets declined in reality. Why? Right? In fact, the answer being the same one to the following part, because the author says, many of the heroes that become gods or stars were already of divine birth or through divine intervention. So the aspect of, again, as we were saying before, gods, for example, different gods, or even the stars that you see are many, right? They are just fitting hierarchically in this broader, again, system of that dominated by perfection at the top, right? And so representing, in a sense, also that part of limitation that is not the perfect one. So again, all gods are somewhat an emanation of a supreme principle. So are the stars, because they're not the sun, for example. And it says they were already of divine birth or through divine intervention heroes. Now, these latter two are two different concepts, because divine birth is, let's say, yet another misconception, we could call it, address it like this. In theory, all humans are of divine descent, right? We are a fallen kind. Leave aside, what the Judeo-Christian side of the story says, with a language that I would like to verify, especially in the original source where I, an expert, linguist, philologist, etc., and that may even hint at the idea of a divine filiation, right? And you know that there is all the problem of Gnosticism, etc. But it's because our ignorance has in part hijacked also Judeo-Christian tradition. In any case, we are all fallen kind. Like the vision of the universe as this emanation from the divine could easily fit, for example, evolutionism, except in reverse. The idea that all species that we see are just, by different degree, a degradation of the divine race, right? And that's also why, for example, Indo-Europeans, also in these mythologies, the fight is between the race of the gods, the Uranian one, etc., against the monster-like, animal-like kind of realities. And we see that, for example, in Pelagian religions, this deities is the same concept of minotaurs, like this head of bulls, the same one that Mithras massacres, or donkeys, or this other obsession for the dirt and the earth and the blood and at least in a negative sense from the Pelagian side, because for the Indo-European it was actually an accomplishment, etc. That would have been kind of a sort of an abortion, like at least a degenerate kind of humans that basically, of gods, let's say better, because that's the point, right? That absolute humanity is divine, right? And this would be just some degradations that had an effect on their same genes to degrade into something monstrous, as a matter of fact, like an animal that is incomplete in that perfection really is, right? So being of divine birth, like being born by, even the gods, they are not all at the same level. Like, just how many children did Zeus have with Pelagian beings, right? How much of that same Pelagian substratum still exists in figures like, they're more important, like think about Poseidon, etc. Well, these are lesser ones. So if, say, you are the in fact, as it often happens, like in part of these examples, the son of a Uranian god and a titan, let's say, in a chthonic leader, because at the end of the day, that's what it meant. Like, it's a bit like the angels in the Bible, right? These were some, say, at least they would copulate with some lesser expression of the divinity, because these were already transfigured chieftains or warriors that had won that status. But we know in the same Bible they eventually have sex with mortals, etc., and so other things go on. And these people are born, right? So the being of divine birth there is by which degree, right? You could be divine by 1,000th or by a half, right? But the idea is that we all are by a certain degree, and we are all some kind of expression and degradation of that, depending on where we find ourselves in the hierarchy. And that's why we have the possibility of transfiguring, because that same degradation can go also in the opposite sense. That's why the case, this ferocious, viciously, atrociously, traumatically brutal separation between those who had not been the chosen kind of the conquerors, right? This is particularly evident in the Veda and still in Hinduistic culture, etc. But this was the thing also among other peoples. The entire mythologies, the entire religion spoke of that, as you know. So I'm saying this also for the general audience. I'm not really referring to the author of the question, that I assume being aware, of course, of such things. So divine birth is not like being graced by it. It's just being you, and you have to live with that. Literally, you have to accomplish something, to demonstrate. And in these mythologies, of course, there is a deep racial, genetic, let's say, a reflection into action of these natures. Like, Hercules is why it is, exactly because all these say it's the same. Think about Achilles, etc. So in a way, if it's your nature, there is something that goes beyond, and this can be seen as a grace, like because you were born in the first place because of the love of God. Yes, it can be interpreted perhaps like this. Divine intervention could also be connected to this, the idea that after all, in spite of our sins, we are all in fact God's children. And so there is always a connection and a possibility of redemption on the base of this connection. And again, there is no doubt that transfiguration happens because of that, simply for the fact that there is a God and a truth, right? So going on with the this last phrase actually is important, because connected with the other one is commenting on, is kind of is criticizing the possibility that it's work and fate alone, the individual guy that can transfigure without this kind of divine origins and intervention. As we explained, this is kind of a universal condition. So what remains is your fate and your work, right? And that is what will trigger the divine intervention. It is not random. Again, as it's like the aforementioned example of Arjuna, you have to read through the lines the fact that why he is worthy of Krishna's love and preference and support. But if Arjuna had not been worth of that by himself, he would have not received that. Naturally, this is debatable, right? Because it's always the liminal, asymptotic, incommensurable question is, how did that happen? Like, if you don't transfigure yourself, you cannot know, right? And so this is the problem around which also the various theological differences, the divergencies really revolve around it, depending on the various traditions, on the various religions, all the issue of grace in Christianity. It stems exactly from the same concern. We cannot know. We cannot generally and truthfully say, well, I do know, or you know. But given that it is so liminal and tending to the infinite, literally, the question is, it doesn't even matter to ask. Like, if you know that the direction is faith and work, and you simply don't know because your faith and consequent works are imperfect, you don't have but to go on. It's literally what Krishna tells Arjuna. You're a warrior, so you don't have to fear about this all. If you win, you will conquer the world. If you die, you will have earned heaven. So you have me, right? You have me as always, as God, right? As the truth. So through that, I will let you crush. This is just like in the Bible, right? The Jews' relation with God is deeply strained. And the Jews fight against God too. And that's what it makes them the chosen people. It's just like Mithras, as we were saying before. And God forms an alliance and he fights at their side. So, but it's always their virtue in that regard that makes it, right? Also in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as you know, this thing changes over time. And the Bible being very, very literally and historically the evident proof of it, right? So the point is that you cannot accomplish anything in the first place if you not enter that consonance with the divine. How this is eventually declined in the explanation of human literature may mislead regarding what happens to the infinite, right? But it's the concept and the tenets that is to be followed, right? There is only one direction: fight, right? Naturally, with some qualities that you have to cultivate, so that it's not just mere wishful thinking, and that fate is not that. And in fact, this is often misunderstood, at least not because today's it's a problem of Christianity, rather say it's a problem of a general decline of the world. The way we have simply said, okay, we have fate. Like, what is fate? You kind of want to believe that there is a God, but you don't ask yourself too much, even though you know that there is a radically extreme amount of information on it that you should be to be sorted out if you even care or pretend to care about God, and just going with it, living a completely unfulfilled life. Well, that's what mostly fate has become for most people today, right? In those times, they thought that fate had to bring you to sublimate yourself in that kind of transfigurational state to the extreme sacrifice of the self in a holy war again. So not exactly an holy war that is to be fought according to those principles that are taught by the divinity, but that cannot be accomplished in the process without that kind of faith and work. And that's where the individual's work comes into place. And that's why we speak mostly of heroes. As the author of the question points out, yes, it's divine birth, divine intervention. Yes, but it's just a special privileged connection because, again, of that kind of nature that means that you should be able to do this always in parallel, right, with your ability and the divine one. Because in the moment you made the right thing, that consonance will reward you, right? So, as we have read, there are the examples. As for example, I think of Romulus, Diomedes, Dioscuri. There are of different nature. For example, this is very interesting too in the history of the Dioscuri as well. They were all, and it was the same thing with Mithras, right? And they were all divine blood and benefit from the aid by one or more gods. Yes, so we already answered. So the question goes on and says, couldn't that also be broadly considered a form of grace? Yes, of course, in as long as you understand grace, however, in that not in what we have been normally habituated to think it like, just something that arrives every once in a while and that you're just passively receiving, or maybe predisposing yourself to receive, but mostly being this overwhelmingly supernatural thing that you personally have kind of just are privileged by just because God chose you without any personal merit of yours. No, right? So I think the concept is clear. I don't think there is even to digress too much, except stressing the fact that the holy war can be triggered within ourselves all the freaking time, because none of us is devoid of despair by a certain degree, and you cannot attain heaven and that immortality and transfiguration without surpassing this, right? This is present in all religions. This is true also for Christianity. I mean, read the Laude Nove Militia, of the military, the monastic military orders. This is the same for the Islamic Jihad. All these derive from the Indo-European mythology, or at least, again, also from the previous ones that we have seen. I mean, others that were not so, the Indo-Europeans were much more kind of brutally militaristic and whatever, and so we have the best examples there. The same thing is thought in China, a bit more apostatized, but still the imperial culture is the same, the noble military culture is the same, right? So the famous phrase in the Bhagavad Gita, the real never is, the real never is not. The truth indeed has been seen by those who can see the truth. Interwoven in his creation, the spirit is beyond destruction. Interwoven in his creation, right? We are the same, part of the same creation, and we are actually the ones that have the divine spark to understand that concept, because the creation has been entrusted to us. Right? No one can bring to an end the spirit which is everlasting. This is again the hymn to the Logos in the prologue of the Gospel of St. John. If any man thinks he slays, and if another thinks he is slain, neither knows the ways of truth. The eternal in man cannot kill. The eternal in man cannot die. He does not die when the body dies. These bodies have an end in their time, but remains immeasurable, immortal. Therefore, great warrior, carry on thy fight. And this aspect of the transfiguration is also interesting, because the grace is to be understood here as that kind of cosmic consonance that comes as a flow so strong, just like, a tension that makes literally the circuit, that the circuit cannot hold within itself. This is the being, right? The chariot of the sun. Like in the Vedic tradition, this is represented like a thunder, right? That force of the hero essentially striking into the sun, becoming part of it, right? The chariot of the being is exactly the one from which Arjuna fights, having Krishna out inside, not intervening. So this is not, again, a gift. Right? You're chosen for some strange reason. You are deserving that. And Arjuna, in the moment in which he experiences the deity as pure transcendence, says, as roaring torrents of waters rush forward into the ocean, so do these heroes of our mortal world rush into thy flaming mouths. And as moths swiftly rushing enter a burning flame and die, so all these men rush to thy fire, rush fast to their own destruction. This is the power. The power in Krishna adds, I am all-powerful time, which destroys all things, and I have come here to slay these men. Even if thou dost not fight. All the warriors facing thee shall die. Arise therefore, win thy glory, conquer thy enemies, and enjoy the kingdom. Through fate of their own karma I have doomed them to die. Be thou merely the means of my work. Tremble not, fight and slay them. Thou shalt conquer thy enemies in battle. Right? And this last passage would sound absolutely like, this guy's doing nothing. There's Krishna doing all the thing for him. It's not, because Arjuna has accomplished that transfiguration. And this can happen, by the way, in various degrees. Right? There are as great as the, of course, individual life is. This is the other point. And that's why still you could accomplish victory, for example, and this is evident in the Roman imperial triumph, by being at some point, in part, if not Jupiter himself, but quasi-Jupiter. And as you know, the imperator brought the spolia, opima, to the altar of Jupiter to render back that deity, as much as during the Roman imperial funeral, during the decursil, on the burning pyre, it was meant of the sacred fire, to simulate that kind of transfiguration. The soul would be elevated to the heavens, right? Because the same individual had accomplished the absolute power, right? That's because he had transfigured the dark element of himself in the victory itself. That is to say, what we would call the Holy Ghost that descends because of God's grace is also the same one that it can happen by a different degree, right? When you are worthy, right, of something that doesn't make you immediately transfigured, but the self-sacrifice means that you are able to master your true that your own merit of yours that you have earned, that force of yours, that work, that faith, the darkest part of yourself, the one that prevents you, the degenerate part that prevents you not to be God by the fallen kind. And so that at that point you will revert to heavens with that same transfigured soul, and exactly the darkest part of the soul that is instead transfigured in the beautiful Apollonian woman, that is victory, but again the soul of the same individual, right? Which is female because it's the tamed chthonic part of the self. It can truly accomplish transfiguration, right? And that's the reason why this was not really a death, right? This is like also in the in the Ismailitic, in some, as you know, branch of Islam, where literally at some point the Imam disappears, right? The Shia, this is there are sub branches, but the concept is that the Imam at some point disappears. He's not dead. He's ever living, because this is the eternal life that he has accomplished, but not in this dimension that we witness just because of our own faultiness, and not because of the absolute that we can't see because of our own sin, of our own direct responsibility. In other words, it's a doctrine of the awakening of the divine that is already within us, right? And Christianity, in this regard, adds some aspects that are more, say, substantial than actually formal. And the difference with Christianity is that this fundamentally couldn't admit there could be any other individual on earth that could accomplish this but Christ, right? And so the concept behind it is that being God so great that you, in a sense, can hope by faith and work to do something for your own salvation, but it will never be enough without the same God's sacrifice, right? To get rid of your own sinful nature. By accepting Christ as our Lord and Savior, thus meaning what? Like with the preeminence of faith apparently over works, Not that the latter is not important, but that it would have not been ever so important to make us accomplish the ultimate sacrifice, at least by that degree that is truly necessary, right? Who is really without fear? Who can really epurate one's own soul? Again, the pagan tradition had believed that, right? But one had to factually test how much this was true. Of course, this is what the Judeo-Christian tradition brought in there. There are so many other examples of that, but still the idea that our sinful nature prevents us from fully reaching that goal in earthly terms still wants to make us, still doesn't prevent our intentional will of always striving for the better, right? So it is the entire the various Christian confessions have been struggling against each other exactly on these points, right? How, by which measure these things are all true, right? The general impression is that this has somewhat made this has not eliminated the contact between heaven and earth, but has somewhat from one side, some people think this discouraged from taking action with the intention of succeeding, right, to the fullest. But at the same time, has stressed how much the faith there is important, how much we should concentrate on the more spiritual dimension before putting ourselves into action, right? And that this is always been the same concept, right? It's just that this probably speaks of a further status of mankind that has further degenerated to the point of this being necessary for our own salvation. This could be in fact seen as the grace of God in a broader interventional external intervention. This is what in fact the paganism and Christianity struggled on the most to recognize, right? But if you actually think of what this means in practice, well, it's hard to believe that also the latter model doesn't provide with the necessary boosting to improve and to see how much, right, we can God do, right, in his power to solicitate humanity to carry on the fight in spite of the incredible difficulty in attaining salvation. That's a big problem. That's why the work is so important, actually, and why Catholicism actually maintains over Protestantism and much, but not just for this, but fundamentally enough, this much greater idea that what you can do does make a real difference because it is moved by faith, right? And that is a testing of the same faith. So this can be in all the glorious exaltation, as we've seen, the same Christian tradition of the Holy Word, etc., has remarked this, right? So what changed really is at the utmost top that is difficult to reach in the first place, and which other creature could be equal to the greatest God after all? The being, right, and the possibility of being identified also with the Son was in this sense, even in there, the utmost attainment, the greatest example that could be provided by tradition, also in its holy texts. but still it's the only kind of exception. It's a very specific tale, perhaps the most important one in those religions, that shows how powerful the connection, again, between heaven and earth is for humanity to mind its divine potential. But at the same time, all what you see in the rest of the cosmology is that God is God, and all the rest is just something of different degree of perfection compared to him. So you don't have really, multiplication of gods as many heroes that fulfill that there can be. So that even the transfiguration is a big deal, but it happens still within a hierarchy that in heaven that is in fact present even among the gods, and so that is not just an accommodation. So this thing existed in the mythology since maybe not the beginning, but again, everything was seen as a manifestation of God, right? And its denial, the absence of it, right? And so it's imperfection deriving from such denial, the imperfection of creation deriving from such denial by the creation itself, that was endowed with that power that is in the sense separated from God. So the Judeo-Christian tradition is just is choosing to put a greater emphasis on it, but for reasons that are relevant for any human being. Because again, I challenge you to transfigure, and also to you see, these texts do not eventually tell you what happens. They just prepare you to the thing. They show you the way. And that's something that you will have to eventually live by yourself, because nobody really knows or can fully answer that broader question, but just acting. So that's, again, why work is crucial. I hope what I'm saying is clear, because the connection, the comparison with Christianity is fundamental to answer these questions, especially in the meaning of the concept of grace, right? So consider again what grace, given that it's a Latin term, really means here. Grace in Latin is understood as an harmony with a universe, right? So that consonance, that capacity of conceiving yourself, being aware of the cosmic force that permeates the creation, and finding those ways, performing those actions that eventually would be, for example, sclerotized in their rites, but that originally speaking went beyond that. That's also another point, that eventually even paganism declined. We were just talking about it recently, because the same rites were not understood per se, which just already some sort of superstitious adaptation of the idea that, okay, that hero once made that thing, so let's replicate it so that perhaps we will syntonize again on the cosmic harmony, and this will prevent from bad things from happening, right? So that's already secularization and modernization of the concept, and this happened more or less among any culture, as we know, religiously. So that is the measure, if you want, of the human fall, right? But the meaning of gratia in Latin having to do with this concord and harmony. Concord is also synonym used because concordia, but concordia meaning literally having two hearts basically together, right? So the one, as we've seen, of the person and one of the individual. There are two different things. One has still to become. And as such, having that consonance, you would have the thing. Romulus being enveloped by a cloud on the Quirinal hill, and having transfigured. His body was no more, because he had literally gone beyond, right? So that's how it happens. And as such, what we mean as grace is a gratitude that, say, the divinity does express, but for something that you did, right? Not as, again, on average, we have come to think it. Just like the right has became gradually, oh, okay, I will burn this thing to this god, so nothing bad will happen. There is just unity and imbalance between, that, there is hardly anything that you can avoid without the utmost sacrifice of yourself, because otherwise, we know it, physically speaking, it will not be enough, because we still decay much faster than we can do otherwise, and so it's just the utmost use of force. It's almost in fact, it is a Clausewitzian principle. I explained it also in the video about the Fortuna Kaiseris. We'll do, right? So the God's gratitude is won't be enough for what you hope to avert, right? Just touching a horn, hoping that you will not go in a car crash before starting to drive. That's not really an equivalent, unless you give your life the value of, the effort of touching a stupid object. Well, that's insanity, right? So God cannot care less about that, right? If you're not ready to die, literally, for him, and not necessarily even the effort will have been enough per se, and this is a great intuition as well, which, again, think about all the Valhalla's warriors. Well, not all of them will be blessed in the same way by their death on the battlefield, right? Maybe it will not have even been enough for them. Like, the point of transfiguration is not just that you have to die in battle. Actually, that's the moment of transfiguration is the riskiest one, because it's the moment in which the darkest force of the soul are the most frighteningly strong and want to destroy you. That's why the Erinyes, the Furies, even the dark version of the Filzia, the Valkyries appear frighteningly on the battlefield, because that's when the tension is coming closer to make the circuit explode, basically. And if you give up at that moment, those spirits will devour you alive, and you will disappear forever. That is to say, you will not transfigure. And this is what happens to most people in this tradition. That's why they were so, the Pelagians, also the Chthonic, the Dionysian, and the Nocturne were before the Indo-Europeans, other peoples that had that cult of the light, had a negative view of the afterlife. That's why the impoverished masses during the early Middle Ages preferred like the Romanesque architecture to that was dark, heavy, with scenes of hell, etc., because they had to be scared. Naturally, that's Christianity, and still was an Apollonian religion in that sense, but say nothing to compare with the Gothic that reevaluates that power of the individual. But the masses that are subjected, the ones that have lost hope in their hearts, not because somebody ever prevented them from being better, but because they have decided to be too weak and scared and prey of fear, etc. Instead, fear to the soul. Because, again, if you don't transfigure, you dissolve into nothingness. There will be just a shadow of you that will roam the world for a while, and then that will dissolve as well, and everything will be swallowed and disappeared by the deities of the underworld, right? Instead, transfiguration makes you win a place in heaven. But even in there is a hierarchy of who gets closer, the closest, and you will not become God. Interestingly enough, even so, when we look at figures like Mithras, etc., we're looking at the greatest accomplishment possible. But it doesn't mean that even in the degree of transfiguration, you will necessarily transfigure in the, say, in the most, right? This is important because even the way we conceive transfiguration could be a product of that greater difference that we think existing in between earth and heaven per se, that is a kind of a Judeo-Christian legacy, at least for it has come to be tendentially, but not really meaning that necessarily. And it's a bit what you find in Hinduism with the concept of with the doctrine of reincarnation. That is to say, at every cycle you turn into something that you kind of deserve, right? So it always happens by degree. It can be anything, right? There are not some kind of standardized levels, or even if there is some conception of it, it's just because it came to be in our secularized, modernized view that needs to conceptualize abstractly, but it will always be the right adaptation to what you deserve. So also grace works in the same fashion. And you can imagine being in the sense of different level, right? Whatever happens to you because you have done something, right? So what comes back to you as a consequence is what you have fully deserved in everything. Even illnesses, even the worst tragedies, and what appears to be unfair because we have stopped thinking about this concept, is connected to it, right? Your constant laziness, your constant tiredness, your constant carelessness, that is also the degree of your lack of faith and consequently lack of work. And you will pay for it because you feel at every second that there is something wrong and you're not doing enough, right? Just to make an example that can be understood better, in the original tradition, in the utmost concept, that again, we don't have to think it necessarily existed, because again, if humanity has always decayed, just in the age of gods, this could exist, right, as a concept. But then it was sacred war. That's why all these poems talk about it, right? Because that's the utmost, most important thing, right? And the greatest sacrifice, the moment of, and it is true, it's a Clausewitzian principle, war is the single most chaotic and dangerous endeavor that humans can pursue with a positive degree of control on it, of the entire other human action. So it's the best testing ground. It's a very moral and scientific reality that everybody should know. And this is, again, the concept of sacred war is mostly internal, because as von Clausewitz teaches as well, war is primarily a matter of moral forces, without which you can't really do much in the first place. So the sacred war, self-sacrifice, for the Romans, it was the so-called mors triumphalis, etc. So you die in the moment in which you triumph. And that's the same concept of Christ triumphing over death, right after the Passion, the horrifying test he got through, because, in Christian terms, that Christ is the Agnus Dei. So it's literally there for saving humanity, a sacrifice to Satan. It's like the Roman devotio, right? And the idea that in the moment in which you suffer physically, you still are paying for it, right? And the way to win over this is not to fear that, not to feel that, not to be so driven, to have so much faith, to transcend that illusory reality, which is it doesn't really exist. It derives just from the fall of mankind, from our own faults, right? And that's the true Satan. That's why we are redeemed by the sacrifice. So what this absolute concept was, eventually from a cultural point of view, was declined mostly what you see, and we see in every video we make basically about military history, in the war waged, for example, in the name of the right and the honor of one's lord, like in the warrior caste. As we have seen in the Gaelic fiannas, the Germanic comitatus, in the war bands of the Verdi Italicum and so on, all what you have there is the explicit, actually, from the sources, equivalence between, say, the devotees, so the war band warriors, and the chieftain, the leader, that is provided in virtue of his victorious capacity by that degree of grace slash victory slash imperium that he has earned, because having met the consonants of nature, having understood how that thing works by divine creation, and having therefore this kind of, in fact, sacred part of sacredness, right? That's what you see also in the miracle of transfiguration in the gospel. It's literally an aura. It's literally what you have, in fact, in the Roman triumph with the laurel, with the literally the imperator looking like Jupiter, so shining in that light that is beginning the transfiguration, but it's not enough until the utmost sacrifice, right? So we find these meanings throughout all our political, military, and social history, and we can appreciate, unfortunately, naturally, their degradation. The fact that we are losing that power, that we have been losing it throughout all this time. And thus, it's obvious that also the sacred texts form this ambiguity, because they are human texts. And so they tell things in ways that have to make us understand, even though we are of a fallen kind that can barely understand that. And it goes far beyond. So, just to conclude, the question said, also in the Vedic tradition, Arjuna needed the intervention of Krishna to be able to fully fulfill his duty. To further clarify, I do not intend the well-Christian meaning of grace, but only it as the necessary medium of transfiguration. So, yes, you cannot transfigure without grace, because there is no such fate and work achieved that can succeed without that consonance, and therefore that grace, that harmony, that concord with God. That is God's gratitude, right, for having improved yourself fundamentally in the process. But it happens at the same time. It's not. It is necessary, but it's not a cause-effect reality, especially in a temporal sense. If we were to consider time, it can be just a cause-effect dynamic, because, say, God is more important, so in that regard, but it's never a random intervention. It's never we may not understand it fully by the degree it happens, right? We may, let's say, the way we perceive it is like when we, for example, we succeed in something and we think, and we have deserved it, but we think that maybe we have accomplished more eventually than what we did, and then there is something that makes us understand, wait a minute, maybe I was not a fraud, but here I was not right, and here maybe other people were wrong, and here I simply also am overestimating myself. So that's how it happens, but the truth, in this sense, can never lie, right? And that's why it's up to you to come to the truth, and the truth will come at you in that moment, right? Transfiguration is going that far to achieve it, and it's definitely something that requires extraordinary capacities. So there will be really a lot to tell, because there is plenty of references in the text regarding this, so you can really build a very big let's say, like a big theory, and that's how we know these things in the first place. But it's also kind of intuitive. Right? After all, it's all simpler than it seems. I guess that this is properly the confusion and the lie, the problem, that explained like this, religion, of course, acquires just a much greater meaning, but not great, just, people start getting what that actually is, because I believe most people haven't the palest idea of what the hell religion is. They have been specifically taught and trained not to understand religion, and actually to have very aggressive, violent, and hateful distrust towards it, because of the forces of evil, because they have literally been, let's say, tempted to think that they know better than sacrificing themselves, and therefore gone on with their lives as if, after all, whatever you think, whatever you do is fine, and not, making an atrocious effort to the point of self-annihilation to prove that you can be what the same contempt that you have towards religion for, that is for your own individual favor, really can be healed, right? So this is, I guess, the main take we can have here, and I really believe there is a chance to revive, because again, in spite of the fall of times, the actual protagonist is humanity, also individually. So this cannot be accomplished without the single individual. And that's why we have been told that, after all, we are doomed anyway, because we can't, it's all materialistic, right? We are told by physics that everything declines. Well, even if it were true, moral forces cannot be measured in those terms. They're surely affected by that, but they are not that. They're something else. They're different in essence, and they're there exactly to cope with that limitation that may as well be an illusion and or a product of our own mistake itself, right? So that's why people don't seem to have any force anymore in anything, and why any kind of cultural, moral, personal, educational standards is radically disgusting at every single level. There is no country, but not even no religion anymore, that is actually at the level that you can't say, well, this is normal, right? It's not because of the religion. It's because of the people. Because the real problem are the people, as always. That's the only problem we should be concerned of. Because if people were capable, we would live in a much better world, and it would be much easier for us to accomplish ever more. And you may never know where it leads until you try. And that's the exact point, right? So this was perceived individually. Tradition started from, yes, some concepts that were also communitary, but that at the end of the day represents still, however, a limitation in the moment in which they get. It all starts from the individual. And it all starts from how you make reality be. So this must necessarily start from it, as always, for any sensible change. We could add too much, but I'm getting distracted by things I can't mention, at least in the video. And we will keep talking about history of religion. I want to thank the author of the question, and all the other followers that comment, etc. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.